The title's a little misleading because really that's the title of the Future Fellowship, and I've only just really started the Future Fellowship, and we're in the process of putting the data set together for that. So it's actually really timely because I've got a meeting with the linkage unit on tomorrow about the linking of the data, and there's a few things going on. But I guess really what I wanted to talk about is the underlying studies that are forming part of the Future Fellowship project. And just alert you to some data sets that we hold at Monash that I look after that have a lot of quite unique data within them that may actually be useful for some of the work that you want to do, particularly in the disability sort of injury outcome space. So I run a research that's pre-hospital emergency and trauma. So we have a number of clinical registries, injury registries, but we also run some clinical trials as well, predominantly in the pre-hospital setting. So some sort of funny things that are going on. But I'm going to talk first about, oh, I forgot about that bit, the problem that we're having in injury. So many of you are sort of very well aware of the Global Burden of Disease study and the joys of the Global Burden of Disease study. In all of the burden estimates, injury tends to make up about 9 to 10% of the burden. But most of that burden is actually attributed to mortality. So something like 79% of the burden of injury is actually attributed to mortality, which to us as injury researchers really doesn't make a lot of sense. And we think a lot of that is because we've been in a situation where we've had really a complete global shortage of any information about what the long-term implications of injury actually are. There's a long-held perception that if you have a spinal cord injury or a severe traumatic brain injury, you will have permanent disability. Makes sense, makes perfect sense. The same if you have a limb amputation. And that's really been the focus of the National Injury Insurance Scheme, which is going to roll out as a sort of side to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So the focus has really been on what we would actually call catastrophic injury. So spinal cord injury, severe traumatic brain injury, limb amputation tends to be the things that people consider as actually leading to permanent disability or permanent impairment, however you want to describe it. What we've really struggled with in the injury space is any information around any other type of injury and whether how long people take to recover, how well they actually recover, and whether there are other forms of injury that actually go on to have long-term disability and long-term implications from their injury. So pretty much for the last decade, I've been leading a lot of research, and I'll present some of it today, which has really been around looking at that sort of serious hospitalised injury group and doing quite a lot of longitudinal work following up patients on a large scale, and I'll talk about the scale when we get to the registries. And with colleagues overseas, we've been pooling data together from various studies, and what we've been able to kind of show is that a lot of the assumptions that underlie the global burden of disease, and this is probably not new to you guys, is that this is not valid. So the assumption is that if you have multiple injuries, then only the most serious injury is actually contributing to the disability that you sustain. We've categorically shown that's not true. That there are a lot of injuries where there are no disability weights for them, despite the fact that there are no long-term disability weights for them, under the assumption that there is no long-term disability and people will always recover from those injuries. So we've got this sort of underlying sort of friction between what's coming out in burden studies and what we're actually seeing clinically and what we're seeing through the data that's rolling in now around the long-term implications of injury. And what we've come to the conclusion that is that they're likely, these burden estimates are likely to profoundly underestimate the disability that's actually occurring, and we need to do something about that. Because unfortunately, while a lot of, there's a lot of political will behind something like the GBD study, it's very influential, and if it's categorically wrong, then injury's in trouble. So that's sort of the background to where we're at. So what we're seeing in Australia is actually, we're seeing rising rates of hospitalisation for injury. So the number of people that are admitted to hospital every year or visit an emergency department every year for injury is rising on a fairly linear, fairly consistent trajectory. If a lot more people are living with the long-term impacts or permanent disability related to injury, then we're going to have to deal with that in our social and public, in our clinical and medical care policies. Because otherwise we're going to be in a situation where we're not going to have the services to match the needs of the population. We have wildly outdated cost of healthcare estimates for injury. And when I'm talking about wildly outdated, I'm talking decades outdated here. So no one's really had a crack at this properly since about the 2000s, since the early 2000s. So we have virtually no information about this. And the main issue we've got is that in all of the prevention interventions that are put forward, they're almost all being assessed on their cost effectiveness for preventing mortality, which is actually a smaller component of injury. So most people now, even if you have a severe injury, the likelihood of dying from that serious injury or severe injury is very low because the care is so good. Okay, so the problem is we're measuring the effectiveness of injury prevention strategies on the basis of information that's really outdated and doesn't take into account what gains could be made by the prevention of disability that may occur. And so unless we sort of do something about this, we're in a bunch of trouble. And, you know, with rising injury rates, rising population, more cars on the road, anybody cycle? Anybody ride their bikes? Yay. Anyone ride a motorbike? Yeah, bad news. We're seeing these really, you know, we really are finding new and exciting ways to injure ourselves. And cycling is the one road. Cycling and motorcyclists are really the two that are bucking the trend. So while it's becoming safer to travel in cars, it is certainly not if you're riding a bicycle, and it's certainly not if you're riding a motorbike. So. And then we've got this other problem of this massive problem of falls in the elderly, and that growing aspect of the ageing population and everything else. And, you know, there is really no clear interventions that are going to sort of stop that trend. So we're in a bit of trouble because we've got a rising number of people being injured. We're not doing that well on the prevention aspect of it, and we're underestimating the amount of care that these people are going to need into the future. So we're in a bit of a mess. So what we've been, yeah, go on.
The rising hospitalization, is that due to the change in the composition of different accidents now?
Yeah, it depends on the type of data that you're looking at. It depends on whether you're looking at ED presentations, admissions to hospital, or major trauma data. So in our major trauma data, the classic patient is, in the major trauma data, the classic patient is injured in a road vehicle crash, quite significant head injury or spinal cord injury. You know, that's young male. They tended to be our bread and butter. But what's happened over the last decade is we're having a fairly massive shift in who our major trauma patient population are. And that group of patients is actually declining a bit, or holding really steady numbers wise. But, you know, with the rising population, it's, you know, it's a relative decline. What we're seeing a hell of a lot more now in our major trauma patients is seriously injured older people. So, and a lot of low falls in that. And part of that is we image better and we're much more aggressive about treating them, and the help, you know, with healthy elderly, the impetus to treat is much higher. But we are seeing a shifting patient population. But as I said, of the road user groups, motorcycles and particularly bicyclists are the two that are really bucking the trend. And what we're seeing is a shift away from the severe TBI and spinal cord injury, which has been a focus in the past, and a shift to more of multiply injured patients who don't have spinal cord injury or severe traumatic brain injury. So that's what's been happening. Our major trauma patient population is ageing. It still remains male dominated. About 70% of major trauma patients are male. That's another story. We can have that later if you want to know the story behind that. But so we've been trying to sort of inform this space with data we're collecting, with some quite unique data sets that are actually Victorian based. And the first of these is one that I run, and it's the Victorian State Trauma Registry. And I'll just talk that up at the top there. It says, I'm not sure if I can make that go away, but talks about the state trauma system. So we have a pretty amazing trauma system here in Victoria. So you may not know this, but if you happened, and hopefully this will never happen to you, injured in a motor vehicle crash or injured in any way and quite injured severely, you will actually be transported through to well, you guys will be too but there is a paediatric centre as well. One of 3 major trauma services within the state. So we'll bypass smaller hospitals, bring you directly into a major trauma service, which is essentially a one-stop shop for serious injury. It's a pretty effective system in that we've categorically shown that it reduces the risk of mortality, and that's been shown around the world. So that's why what I'm saying is they're more likely to survive these serious injuries. It's because of things like regionalised trauma care. We have single ambulance services, an entirely integrated system. So there are guidelines about when the ambulance officers bring you to particular hospitals. The reason I actually bring it up is because when they implemented the trauma system in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they had the good sense to actually decide that when they were going to do a major policy shift to regionalised trauma care, that they would implement some way of monitoring that change. And so that's how the Victorian State Trauma Registry came about. It is a population-based trauma registry, so we capture information about every seriously injured patient in the state, irrespective of where their care is received. So there's 138 trauma services within the state. Only 3 of them have a major trauma service accreditation, or what do they call it? Oh, I can't remember what they call it now, but and we collect data from all of those trauma receiving hospitals. So it doesn't matter where you go or where you're cared for, we'll actually receive the information about the major trauma patients. It started off, in the last 10 years, there's been something like 49% increase in the number of major trauma patients in the state. We started off receiving about 2,000 a year. It's now closer to 3,500 patients a year that we actually receive data for. So it's pretty good. We use opt-off consent, so everybody who's eligible comes onto the registry. They have the opportunity through a letter and a brochure of knowing they're on the registry and having the opportunity to be removed. And it's about 0.2 or 0.3% of patients who actually opt off completely from the registry. What I did want to do was, everything around trauma has all been measured in the state of mortality. So the outcome that people have been most interested in is mortality. In our major trauma patient population, the mortality rate is roughly about 8 to 9%. So we've got 90+% of our patients surviving their injuries. So for me, mortality is not the outcome I'm particularly interested in. What I want to know is what the impacts are for the patients into the future. So fortunately, one of the funders of the registry is the Transport Accident Commission. And the other funder is the Department of Health and Human Services. Originally, the Department of Health were not interested in long-term outcomes at all, full stop. Their interest, because of the federated way that healthcare is provided, emergency care and hospital care, acute care is provided by the state or paid for by the state, but rehabilitation and aged care is paid for by federal. So long-term, so once they leave the hospital, it's no longer the Department of Health and Human Services responsibility, or so they think. But the Transport Accident Commission is obviously very interested in that, because once you're a TAC claimant, you're a lifetime claimant. And that's where their biggest burden is in the long-term care of the patients. So we managed to implement first I got a 6-month follow-up onto the protocol. And since then, since 2007, we've also been following all our patients up at 1 year and at 2 years after injury. And there are no exceptions. So we attempt to follow up everybody who's on the registry, even if they live interstate or overseas. Yeah, we've tried to follow up everybody. And progressively, we've been adding some linkages to the data as well. So I put this slide up to tell you that my job and the registry's job is not around research. The registry's job is around informing policy and informing the ministerial committee, the State Trauma Committee, about how to manage trauma in the state. So really, the registry itself is funded to do that purpose. We're lucky in a lot of respects because we have additional grants and we have additional fellowships and funding that allow us to sort of expand the research side of it and build on it. And through that, that's how we've been able to get the sort of major changes going on. But this is just my day-to-day responsibility with the registry. This is the definition for a case to come onto the State Trauma Registry. So if there's a death, any death related to injury, they'll come onto the registry. If there's an injury severity score greater than 12, which is a really kind of very clinical way of looking at it. So essentially what happens is that for every case, all of the injuries they've sustained get coded with something called the abbreviated injury scale. And with that comes a little, what they call a post-op number. So every part of the code talks about which part of the body, what kind of structure is injured, and then the post-op number is actually severity scaling. But that severity scaling is built entirely around risk of mortality. There is an alternative for risk of disability. It's complete crap because we've got a PhD student who's actually looking at it, and there's no relationship with actual patient outcomes at all. But they were pretty keen to get something into the AIS. It's a very expensive way of characterising injury, but it's a hell of a lot better than ICD-10-AM. So ICD-11 will probably solve some of those problems. We also receive any patient who's admitted to intensive care for longer than 24 hours, as long as they're mechanically ventilated for part of that, even if it's for a really short period of time. And we also receive every patient who has a long list of surgeries, and they can be things like having a halothoracic brace for a spinal fracture, laparotomy, so if they've gone to sort of fix a spleen or a liver or whatever it might be. So it's a lot more than spinal cord injury, severe TBI, and amputation. The information that we get on the registry before we do the follow-up is really a lot of information around the patient. It's an identifiable registry, so we capture identifying information for every case, which makes us inherently linkable. So we also get things like UR numbers, admission numbers, all sorts of things that make us really inherently linkable. We also get information from the pre-hospital setting, which most trauma registries in the world don't actually do. So we get that straight from Ambulance Victoria. We collect information about what's happened to the person. We get diagnostic information, as I said, from the AIS and the severity scoring, but also we do get all of the ICD-10-AM diagnosis codes and all of the procedural codes from their admission. We collect some other outcomes, length of stay, discharge destination, and in-hospital mortality, obviously. The long-term outcomes we do at 6, 12 and at 24 months, and we've had some little changes over time. So in January 2016, we ditched the SF12 and went to the 12-item HUDAS, which is the World Health Organization's Disability Assessment Scale. Just a much better instrument, and it wasn't available when we started doing the follow-up of patients in 2003. So we added the EQ5D 3L in 2009, so we've got quite a lot of that data now. We use something called the Glasgow Outcome Scale Extended, which is actually a head injury instrument looking at function, and it rates a person's sort of level of function on a scale from 1 being death to 8 being an upper good recovery. And an upper good recovery means that they really have no issues related to their injury at all, and it's actually quite hard to get into that category. In our major trauma patients, probably less than 1 in 5 get there by 2 years. So it's actually surprisingly sensitive and surprisingly responsive to change. We do get some information about pain, and we also capture information about return to work and work disability, so whether they've returned to the same organisation and whether they've returned to the same role within that organisation. Paediatric patients, we've actually only been following up since March of 2010, and we use just some slightly different instruments. The Paediatric Quality of Life Inventory we're actually ditching, and in January 2018 we'll actually change over to the Youth EQ5D, because the PedsQL is just not actually working that well for us. I'm just finishing a paper at the moment about it. And over the time we've added some linkages, so we get data directly from Ambulance Victoria, AV, and also from Adult Retrieval Victoria, which is the group responsible for moving patients between hospitals, which only started in 2008. We get information or have access directly to the coroner's data. We link with the state deaths registry, but at this stage we only get the date of death. We don't get any information about cause of death. So I pleaded a case this week to the deaths registry, and they seem really open to it now, which is amazing how time changes and suddenly someone seems to think it's okay. And I'll talk a little bit about how I managed to argue that we're still waiting for them to do a ruling. We get TAC claims data directly for every TAC claimant, and it's about over a third of the patients on the registry are TAC claimants. When we get item by item details for the patients, it's quite overwhelming when the data actually comes to us. And for the last few years, we've been approved to link with the Department of Health and Human Services data. We've become part of the linkage map because we are a Department of Health, what they call asset. The registry is an asset. But we haven't done a lot. And has anyone worked with the Victorian Data Linkage Unit? It was fun, wasn't it? Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about where we're going with it. I'll talk about Restore because this is a subset of the VStorm patients or the State Trauma Registry patients. And this is an NH and MRC funded project where we've just finished a data collection for it. But it's essentially a collaboration between Australian investigators, some investigators from the UK and from New Zealand as well. We've been looking at 1 year of major trauma patients, so almost 3,000 patients who were injured between July 2011 and June 2012. And they've all had their routine 6, 12 and 24-month follow-ups, but through this project we've been able to follow them all up again at 3 years, 4 years and at 5 years after injury. And we've also been doing a nested longitudinal qualitative component to that as well. And there's been, we sampled for that, there's 157 patients from memory, and we sampled them across key groups, so severe traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, paediatric major trauma, and also the biggest sort of more nebulous other major trauma group. When we did the quantitative interviews, we asked some additional information. So we're using something called the CHIEF short form, which is really about environmental and more about environmental barriers. So talking about dealing with policy, government, physical environment, school, work, those types of things. The impact of event scale, which is a sort of psychological distress measure, and also some information about where they're getting their income from. So getting some idea of and it's been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Some of them have 1 year gotten a Slovakian pension, and then the next year they've moved the entire country, and got another pension, moved over to another country and got another pension to sort of keep themselves going. Just looking at where they're sourcing their income from, because the return to work rates actually aren't that great. So that's sort of quantitatively what Restore is. And this is the Restore cohort at the moment. So we started with 2,000, nearly 3,000, of which about 300 died in hospital. Before we even hit the 6-month follow-up, we had nearly 100 deaths in that cohort. Between 6 and 12 months, we lost another 39 patients. And you can see roughly between each follow-up, we lose about 50 patients. So this has been helpful for us with the deaths registry, because we've actually been able to show that the post-discharge mortality rate is actually about 7-fold higher than you would expect for an age and gender matched population.
Are they deaths actually arising from complications from?
We don't know. That's why we've gone to the, so at the moment we know they've died, we don't know why they've died. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why so this is the argument we've been using in going to do the deaths registry to say we need cause of death information, is because we actually have no idea whether they're dying because of their injury or whether it's, something else going on, and we need to be able to explain that, because how you'd handle those situations are entirely different. So we've got quite a group of intentional self-harm patients as well, and so we need to know if they've gone on to complete the suicide, so if they've survived and then they've gone on to complete the suicide, that's sort of a fair indication that mental health care is pretty rubbish. So that's information that we really need to know. We've completed all of our 3-year, 4-year and 5-year interviews, and we've also completed all of the qualitative interviews as well. So the data set's now closed and complete. Down in the bottom left-hand corner is the linkage with the administrative data sets, which we actually are in progress doing. We're waiting for an update of claims data from the TAC, because we want a full 5 years after their initial injury, which takes us to June of 2017, and TAC data is only just finalising for that time at the moment. Just to give you a bit of an idea about what the patient population looks like, that red bar down the bottom is post-discharge mortality, which you can see going up quite a bit. The bar above it is severe disability, and you can see that narrowing over time. So if they're surviving, they are tending to do a bit better. There ain't a lot of movement at the top of the scale. After about 2 years, really the green bars are really the upper good recovery. So this is the group of patients who aren't having a lot of implications from their injury, and they are not changing a lot. So what we're seeing is quite a proportion of our patient population who are still having quite significant deficits from their injuries. This is actually, have you seen lasagna plots before? Have you guys ever seen these before? The lasagna plot, so if this is our 6-month time point, this is the group who were not doing that well. The red group are not doing well, and this is what happens to, so everything below that bar is what happens to them. So this is the group that got better at 12 months. And then this group here splits again. So some of them get worse, some of them get better. And you can see that group splits again and splits again. So you can see we have a pretty complex recovery trajectory over, this is just 4 years. We haven't done this for the 5-year one, but you can see that what we've learned from this is that recovery actually isn't a linear or static. People don't just stay the same or get better. They actually do get worse over time. So, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that may actually be happening. But these are the sort of things that we've been starting to look at, because we're starting to deal with data that just hasn't been around before to sort of try and figure out what's happening. But we've got this really complex group. Yeah, go on.
After that time, outcomes relatively stable?
No, this is actually, this is 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years and 4 years. Yeah, yeah. Yes, they just keep on being. So ultimately, cumulatively, what you get is that the green group gets bigger over time, but it's not the same people, and you're not always going in one way. So that creates some complexities in looking at recovery patterns. No, because if they're coming back with that, so part of it is that, well, they're not coming back with major trauma. We do get frequent flyers on the registry. They're almost entirely motorcyclists for I mean, you guys drive on the roads, you know why motorcyclists keep coming back to us as major trauma patients. Yeah, so we can actually, so we know, because we've got identifiable data, we know if the same people are coming back through the data. But in this cohort, we haven't had a repeat offender. But we don't know whether they've come back to an emergency department or they've been admitted to hospital with another injury, but we will through the linkage. Yeah. These are the return to work patterns. So Alex Colley's just finished a paper looking at the first 4 years of return to work patterns out of the Restore cohort. He's one of our co-investigators. So he's now running the work injury, I don't know what it's called now. It's very complicated. But he's got a new group within the faculty that he's running. And you can see the same sort of pattern again, is that people keep moving. But what they tend to fall into is a number of groups, those that go back to work and stay at work, those that never go back to work, those that go back to work and then fail, and those that just take a really long time, but eventually they get there. So he's been sort of looking at what the characteristics of those patients actually look like. Yeah, so we capture if they've gone back to full-time work, part-time work and the like. So here we've just gone if they've gone back to any work in this particular plot. But yeah, these are people who are who were employed prior to their injury. Yeah. So whenever we look at the return to work data, we really only focus on those who were working prior. Yeah. No, we don't, but it comes through in the qualitative data in some fairly significant ways. And women are a group of major trauma patients who have a much lower, adjusted for everything else, much lower return to work rate than the men do. In fact, women generally have poorer outcomes overall when they're injured. Yeah, yeah. We don't. We collect information about the child from the parent. And they've participated in the qualitative interviews, and where possible the child's participated as well. So we'll often get information from the child and the parent if they're 8 years of age or above, because ethically we're not allowed to talk to the younger ones. Yeah, so we don't, only through the qualitative work. Yeah, through the qualitative work. So this is just having a look at change over time, so between each of the time points, and it's just a little colour coded out of Restore. So this is the first 4 years, and you can see that there's a lot of green in that first 6 to 12 months, so people are doing much better. And then from 12 to 24 months, again, on most of the outcomes, they're improving. But then things start to get pretty static, And then we start getting some things taking a long time to get better and some things actually going in the opposite direction. And through the qualitative interviews, we're getting quite a lot of issues around access to pain and mental health services for patients. It's becoming really obvious. But you can see that it's not just this sort of clear improvement trajectory. We've got a whole lot of stuff going on. So this is a paper that just came out in PLOS Medicine, which is the EQ5D outcomes up to 3 years from the cohort. So if you do want to have a look, it's open access, obviously. We have a protocol paper, and we also have started to publish from the qualitative work. So the question here around the caregivers' reports about children and their activity levels, that's one of the ones that's come out so far. Also the impact on transport and how people get around has come out as well in the Journal of Transport and Health. I haven't added that. So Restore is a subset of the State Trauma Registry, which is now starting to sort of build on the knowledge that we're getting along the way. Another one that we have is this Victorian Orthopaedic Trauma Outcomes Registry. This is a little different because it's not population-based. It's a sentinel site registry. There's roughly about 50 to 60,000 admissions a year in Victoria for fractures. We can't get funding to follow them, to get them all and follow them all up, because it would be unbelievably expensive. So this is a sentinel site registry. There are 4 participating sites. The Alfred and the Royal Melbourne Hospital, which are our 2 level 1 trauma centres or major trauma centres for adults, Northern Hospital, and also Geelong, which is one of the busiest sort of regional hospitals as well. We capture about 6,000 patients a year, and they just really have to be admitted to hospital for longer than 24 hours. So pretty much every fracture case that gets operated on by an orthopaedic surgeon meets those criteria. And that's been collecting data since 2003. But we added the Northern and Geelong in 2007. So when we talk about long-term outcomes data, we tend to talk about data from 2007 onwards as being really consistent. That's when we added 12 and 24-month data and the like. So there's just a few differences in the outcome, in the information we capture on the orthopaedic registry. We don't get any pre-hospital data. We don't get the complex AIS coding of injuries. We're very reliant on ICD-10-AM, which gives us a lot of trouble because there's no laterality in ICD-10 for injury. But one thing that we do capture information about is implants. So whether, plates, screws, rods, all of that sort of stuff. So we capture all of that information. It's an absolute dog's breakfast because hospitals are not actually required to capture information and link it directly to a patient. They're just required to capture information for ordering purposes. So it's quite a mess when it comes to us and takes quite a lot of work to sort of get it looked at. But and there are no paediatric patients in the orthopaedic registry, but we keep them, they share the same database. The State Trauma Registry and the orthopaedic one share exactly the same database, and we do exactly the same follow-up. So all of our follow-up staff follow up all of the patients consistently. So it gives us a little bit more power to look at some less severe injuries. And then VIBES was a project that was NHMRC funded where we pulled some data from around the world. Originally it involved Teo Voss. Teo is not as keen on what comes out of the injury information and what we say about the GBD process. So Teo hasn't really been involved that much with the project. Kavi Bala and James Harrison, who's from Flinders University in South Australia, were the original chairs of the Global Burden of Disease Injury Expert Group. They've entirely disengaged from the GBD project. They are not on any papers and they have completely disengaged from it. And I've stopped going on papers related to it as well, just through frustration that we can't. Yeah, I'm just frustrated, so we've given up a bit. But here we pulled data for about 40,000 patients from cohort studies in the US, my 2 registries here, Dutch data, UK burden of injury data, and also data from New Zealand, which was rare because that was a cohort that actually oversampled people who'd never been to hospital and also found the same issue as that there's quite a lot of long-term. They followed people up to 2 years and quite significant long-term disability, even in the people who don't go to hospital. We've had a whole bunch of this. So when I was talking earlier about some of the stuff about the sort of the assumptions that sort of underpin the GBD project, you know, we've actually, so GBD doesn't use EQ5D where they can. They'll actually map EQ5D to SF12, which we actually don't think is really possible. If you've seen them, they're quite different. And we've validated some SF12 to EQ5D maps. We've looked at multiple injuries. We've looked at different ways of categorising injuries. And in late last year, we published a paper in WHO Bulletin, which was alternative disability weights for injury, separated by ED presentations and hospital admissions as well, which showed that virtually, except for spinal cord injury and severe traumatic brain injury, the disability weights that are based on patient experience from the EQ5D were actually profoundly higher than the ones that the GBD were using. So we were able to generate disability weights for injuries where there are none for the GBD project or in any of the weight sets for the GBD project, but we could also validate some of the ones that they do for spinal cord injury and others. So this has taken us to the grand plan, which Tony has kindly got involved in, which is for the future fellowship work, where we are looking to do a few things, but really about pooling the data from the registries and from Restore and doing a major linkage with Department of Health data, deaths data, TAC claims data to have a really good look at the long-term impacts and costs of injury, particularly in Victoria. Working with Zhang and Monash Gabbe from the EPI modelling unit to look at modelling population, to do some population forecasting for how many people are going to be living in the community with disability over time related to injury. Doing quite a bit of geospatial work, so looking about where people are actually living with disability in the state and how that relates to where they're living relative to services through the ORA and overlay. And we've already started doing that with some of the TAC data, looking at mental health and pain services and looking at where people are living and relative to mental health, living with pain and mental health issues relative to where those services actually are. And it's really about sort of partnership development. So the project itself will also involve the AIHW amongst others. And so it's quite a grand plan. I'm not sure how much of it will get done, but this is really what that linked data set's actually going to look like. So we expect we'll have around 40,000 cases from the orthopaedic registry, another sort of 27,000 or so from the state trauma registry, which will also include the additional 3-year, 4-year and 5-year data from Restore. The TAC claims data will get attached to that. The birth, deaths and marriages data will get attached to that. It will go to the linkage unit. They will add the VAED and VEMD data for those cases. And there's some talk that we may actually be able to receive mental health, drug and alcohol service data as well for the first time, which would be fun. No MBS, no PBS. The reason is that we run on an opt-off consent process and and they require an explicit consent process. Yeah. Through the TAC claims data, we do get all, I'll talk about that on the next slide anyway. So the TAC claims data, as I said, is about 35% of our cohort. We get itemised costs with the date and the amount that they've paid and what the service has been for. And that covers pharmaceuticals. It also covers things like in-hospital care, if they've been readmitted to hospital, rehabilitation, all those types of things. Out of hospital care, who they've seen, GPs, surgeons, blah, 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 the whole lot. All of their income replacement data. So if they were working prior to injury, all the money they've received from the TAC for income replacement. Things like attendant care, equipment, those types of things. Anything that basically the TAC is being billed for, we actually get that information for the cases, and also quite a bit of information around common law and common law claims. From the admissions data, the expectation from the cost point of view is we'll get the DRGs and, you know, the routine sort of length of stay, ICU length of stay. And I put it out there now because I'm off to see them tomorrow. So if there's anything you think I should include, our ethics approval for the registry is to link with the data from the Department of Health. It does not say what we're actually supposed to receive and what we can and can't receive. So if we don't ask for it, we won't have it, and they won't offer it voluntarily. So if there's anything that you think that we should include in the linked data set, please say so. Pardon? Ventilation hours, yeah. We have that in our registries, and it's always something that we add, because for us it's an indicator of severity of that admission as well. Yeah. So generally we can get the public hospital identified. We generally can't get a private hospital identified. Although in a previous linked data set they gave that to me by mistake, and yeah, which of course I couldn't use. So I just had to tell them. They said, "Oh, send us back the data. You know, we'll send you a new data set." And I said, "No. I've just spent 3 weeks cleaning this data and analysing it. I'm not giving it back now." Yeah, if I argue. And the reason we ask for that is because we often want to know if they're coming back to the trauma centres. And the other thing that we're doing is some evaluation work. So they've opened a new statewide acquired brain injury service at Caulfield, and my job is to evaluate whether that's changed where patients are moving in the state for rehabilitation care after severe TBI. The ED presentations, generally we get as much information as we can, but to do the urgency related groups we need, they just provide us with the triage category, whether the patient stayed or left before treatment, and the diagnosis for the for that. I have no real health, honestly, no real health economics experience. I have published like 2 papers, one with Jeff Richardson, where I think he felt like he sold his soul to the devil doing some deli work for us with the road trauma stuff. And then one paper I did with the head of the spinal cord service looking at readmissions for ED presentations and readmissions to hospital in the ED presentations in the first couple of years after spinal cord injury. And then I got AJ Mahal to check all of my work. So, so I'm reasonably confident it was okay. AJ thought it was, but I'm a complete novice when it comes to anything health economic related. As I said, there's a possibility we'll get mental health, drug and alcohol data, which in our patient population becomes quite important because we have a high proportion of intentional injury, so assault victims and also intentional self-harm. And obviously we hold all the EQ5D data for the patients ourselves. So that's sort of what we're working with. So I don't think, so really the key goal out of this is to better understand what our long-term outcomes and costs of injury are, and see if we can establish better ways of measuring burden. But we also want to take the linked data that we've worked with and work with AIHW to apply it to their burden of disease estimates for Australia, and they're really open to that, which is great. We're hoping that this data set will create a future resource for people to work on this type of stuff. And because we're an ongoing registry, we would update that linked data set relatively regularly. At the moment, we say we'll do it every year, but if the possibility was we could do it more often, we would. In the Future Fellowship, we have a PhD student stipend for the economic component. So with Tony to co-supervise, or probably mostly supervise. And as I said, it's a collaboration between the FAR Institute in the UK, the Epi Modelling Unit, National Injury Surveillance Unit, AIHW, and also University of Auckland. And if anyone's interested in being involved, please let us know, because it's going to be a mother load of data, is all I can say, and quite a lot to work with. So, and really, if we can get to a situation where we can better inform sort of the evaluation of intervention strategies, I'd be really happy about that too, because I feel that we're probably really underinvesting in prevention, thinking it's not effective because everything's measured on mortality, when we probably are missing out on really quite effective interventions or cost-effective interventions, but we've had no disability data to inform them. And I think that's it really. All the usual slides. So, please ask any questions. Any glaring problems that you can see coming?
Thank you very much. Yes. What would I like to just ask you?
Yeah.
Leaving aside which I'm not sure if we pick up, the burden of illness kind of work and costing money.
Yeah.
What other big questions do you think you can answer with this?
Well, there's a whole lot of stuff we want to answer around the compensable data. So in the linked data I did with the spinal cord patients, we actually discovered a whole lot of, so the reason that project, when we did this project, is because the head of the spinal cord service is saying we're having this huge problem with readmission for urinary tract infections. And the TAC were going through their data and saying that's completely untrue. We just don't have that happening. There's no, it's not a problem. It's not in our data. It's not a problem. And what we found is when we linked the spinal cord injury patients with the hospitalisations data, is those hospitalisations are not being charged back to the TAC. So even though they're injury related, they're actually not being charged to the TAC. If TAC doesn't pay for it, they don't know about it. And so what you've got is a clinical problem that the TAC is denying that's occurring, but is clearly clinically occurring. And the TAC is now aware that there's a whole lot of stuff going on out there that they don't know about. So we're interested in really that healthcare utilisation aspect of it, looking at how far people are travelling for services and how that changes with different injury groups. We're hoping that in the end we'll be able to sort of see changing patterns in the data when we continue to link this data into the future. But really, like, there's 1,000 questions. The TAC have a whole bunch of questions. We've got a whole bunch of questions. The AIHW has a whole bunch of questions. But at this stage, unpicking some of this decline in function and decline in outcome through the linked data is also what we're really interested in. Yeah, so there's a lot. There's a lot.
So I might be able to tell you something about where to focus on prevention.
Yeah. Well, it's the prevention aspect of it. So for something like falls, we just haven't made great inroads at all. With road trauma, we've made much better inroads, but we seem to be on the decline again in that space. So we're having a rising road toll and a really, a rising number of seriously injured patients being admitted to hospital. So we've still got a long way to go in all of those spaces. But I also think it's really around service provision as well, and support of people living in the community with their outcomes. At the moment, the National Injuries Insurance Scheme is really only focusing on the catastrophic end of the spectrum. And we're finding a lot of our patients, particularly in the TAC, really at 3 years, even though it's a lifetime scheme, really all of their benefits really get chopped off at that point. So at 3 years, there's no more income replacement. They can't go back to work. They may have been a roof plumber beforehand. Now they've got a fused ankle. The possibility of climbing up on a roof again is gone, but the TAC will no longer. And their only option at that point is to go through common law and, get a lump sum payout, which is obviously not enough. Work retraining schemes are really poor. That's coming through in the qualitative stuff. So we're hoping there'll be a lot of sort of health, social policy change around the provision of services as well. So if you're, this may surprise you, but if you're injured and you can't work, accessibility to work retraining schemes is very limited. So if you're a TAC client, you can actually get them, but the problem is the quality of them is so poor that most people don't actually get back to work going through work retraining schemes. So they've got access to them and the TAC is paying for them, but the quality of the service is so poor that they're actually really ineffective. So, but from the TAC's point of view is, well, we've paid for it and they've had it. So, there's a whole lot of that sort of stuff going on. Yeah.
So have you had changes in policies over the months that you've been in?
Yeah, and most of it's been at the early end of the care spectrum. So adult retrieval came around because of data coming out of the registries. There's been other policy changes within the trauma system around that. We're trialling new post-discharge care coordinators at the Alfred Hospital at the moment, whose job is to coordinate the discharge planning process and be that single point of contact for patients after discharge. So because of the direct line we have with the Department of Health and with the TAC, we are actually making inroads. Through data we published from the Orthopaedic Registry, they completely changed their policy model, their claimant model. So it structurally changed the whole thing, but made some fundamentally poor choices along the way, which they fully admit. So it really didn't have any impact on claimant health or patient-reported outcomes. And so they're going through that process again. So we do have that direct line into policy change. It's just about having the right data and, making a compelling case. And we have done that a lot in the pre-hospital space and in the early care space, and we're just starting to really move into the sort of long-term care aspect. We're hoping that this will feed into things like the moment we're providing data for the federal actuary around outcomes in things other than catastrophic injury. Yeah.
So what's the process? You have an injury on this car accident, and then the emergency comes and brings you to a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
They will decide to bring you to some hospital from it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's not a personal choice.
Is there any difference in the difference of which hospital you go to? Will this matter?
Yeah, it does actually. So if you come to a major trauma service, you are more likely to survive and you are likely to have better functional outcome to a point. But at some point, you've become so separate from that early care that it no longer makes a difference. So out to about 12 months, being managed in a major trauma service actually makes a difference after 12 months after injury.
Which hospital you go to?
Yeah.
Or is there more higher rates?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So one thing that would be interesting is to record where the emergency picked them up, because that is somewhat random, where they send people off, right?
Yeah, yeah. And
some people do this hospital, some people do that.
well, under the triage guidelines, they're very tightly controlled and monitored about where they take them. So there is a long list of criteria that the patient is considered a potential major trauma patient, and therefore they're instructed. They have 45 minutes in which to get the patient directly to a major trauma service. If they can't do it in that time frame, they can need to go to the next highest level of care, patient stabilised, and then transported into a major trauma service. All of that is fully monitored. And that's all in the data. And at the moment, we're doing all the XY coordinates for all of the residential addresses and also all of the locations of injury as well. So one of my research fellows, Ben Beck, has been doing that because we're trying to figure out why a lower proportion of our patients are coming directly to the major trauma services than they were. So when we first introduced the trauma system, patients came in increasing proportions directly from the scene to the major trauma services. That's declining over time, and our mortality rate is ticking back up again. And we're trying to understand what's going on. Is it because where the injuries occurring is changing? Is it because where the patient pattern of injury is changing and it's much harder for the ambulance officers to identify the cases? Or is it because we've got problems with congestion on the roads and those types of things? So you can sort of see that the data is feeding into a whole bunch of different sort of policy issues. One is around trauma system configuration. One is around care in hospital. One is around care with the ambulance services. One is, around the discharge planning rehabilitation side. And then the rest is around health and social policy when people are back living in the community. So it's really that sort of full continuum of care, which is what a trauma system is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about, prevention, pickup, acute care, rehabilitation, and then community reintegration. But this is the only registry in the world that does that. Pretty much every other registry starts when you arrive at hospital and finishes when you leave hospital. And that's the only data that are collected. Yeah. And they're rarely population-based. They're nearly all single-centre registries. Yeah.
Can you share some experience using the different outcome measurements in monitoring the patient?
Yeah.
That's quite very interesting.
Yeah.
In some of the decisions, you have to say switch between testable on to the
Yeah.
So normally, testable is more comprehensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you switch to a more free. Not for the comparison purpose, or it's different other reasons.
Yeah, so we've switched because the EQ5D is being picked up in paediatric populations around the world, which will give us the capacity to compare data, which we don't have at the moment using the PedsQL. The PedsQL is a really expensive instrument, and also the distributions are becoming increasingly challenging to work with when we do the analysis. It's, everyone talks about, looking at means, but honestly, once you see the data, you can't treat it that way. So it's also more onerous to collect. And the problem we've got now is we do around 3,000 telephone interviews a month. And it's becoming increasingly challenging to get people to pick up the phone and answer. So our follow-up rates are actually really high, around 6 months, because this is population registry, it's, 86%, sort of pushing 90% at 12 months, hovering around 86, 87% at 2 years. It gets more challenging as time goes by. But what we've been doing is analysis, because every time they make a call, that the time and date is logged. And we're actually looking at now over a 10-year period how much it's changed, how many calls it's taking to change, you know, because that helps us with staffing as well. So we're stopping Saturday calls. It's expensive and we're not getting a good return rate on a Saturday through the analysis that we're doing. So PHQL has been disappointing for a whole bunch of reasons. We did a validation study before we put it in, but we've sort of, paediatric major trauma is a really small component. We get about 150 severely injured kids a year. So you need quite a bit of data to have a really good look at it. And now that we've got that sort of first 600 or 700 patients, it's turned out to be really disappointing. So we've decided to go for brevity and international comparisons instead. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, we like it too because certainly in the adult patient population, we like the proxy component. Trauma tends to have a sort of funny distribution. In major trauma, it tends to be young males. And in the orthopaedic trauma patient population, it's young males and old women, the way injury works. And so our older patient population have a high prevalence of things like dementia and those types of things, and they're in aged care facilities. So speaking directly to the patient becomes really challenging. So instruments that we can deliver by proxy become really important as well. So EQ5D has worked well for us. SF12 was hopeless for that reason. And again, we sort of, you know, it just really wasn't enough international comparisons for us to sort of make any real use out of it. And we also like the economic component of it as well, or the potential to sort of go down that road, which we didn't get with the SF. Yeah, we've done a whole bunch of studies looking at different instruments, so maybe we can have a chat. We tried the, when we first did the orthopaedic registry, we tried the AQUAL. Yeah, that didn't go that well. We've tried a few things over the years. Tried things like an SMFA, short musculoskeletal function assessment. We've tried a whole bunch of things, yeah. It's been a long journey. There's no... The Australian ones? Yeah. There are, yeah. Yeah, for the... Yeah, I think there are, aren't there? I thought, but it's from a really small patient population. We use all UK stuff. And when we pull data, we tend to use the UK for everyone. It tends to get used the most often. But I think there are Australian weights, but they just don't, but the patient population from which the weights were developed is smaller than a year of our patient data. So, yeah.
Maybe just one, maybe too big for the last one. So moving on to the end, because the last sort of long-term outcomes. Presumably, the interesting things you can see there. What's going to be determining a long-term outcome you can look at that's new? I mean, the original injury, the community, or the...
Well, I mean, what we're increasingly learning is that the injury itself, what they've sustained, the further you get from the actual time of injury, the less that influential that is on their outcomes. So, yeah. So there's a whole bunch of factors coming in. The things that are coming up as being sort of the key predictors of whether people do well or don't do well include things like socioeconomic status, compensability is like, I mean, you're almost guaranteed to have a poor outcome if your TAC or work-safe compensable. There's what else is coming up? We're looking at geographic region. Age obviously is a big one. Gender, women do worse. We've never been able to explain why women do more poorly than men. It's starting to come out in the qualitative interviews though, the different experiences that men have after serious injury as opposed to women, and the expectations on the women as opposed to the men. And what we find a lot with men is that the women give up their work to care for the male, but the male never does that for the woman. So we really like the qual side of it because we can actually start to get a bit of a feel for why we're seeing certain things in the data. You know, we'll have a lot more sort of capacity to look at sort of time varying factors along the way too with the linked data, which I think will help as well. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it makes it incredibly complex to look at, but it certainly gives us